Detective Flynn entered the building and was instantly met by fellow Detective Terry. Flynn asked him what the situation was as they walked briskly. Terry answered that he was still refusing to talk and said he won't talk to anyone about it. They got to the interrogation room and Terry opened the door. There were 2 policemen waiting for them. The burly man held his hand out for a handshake, greeting Flynn as detective. Flynn took it and asked how they were looking, then glanced at the fellow through the glass pane. The lady replied that the little bugger just won't talk, and that Terry here was about to snap. Terry muttered that was rightly so. Flynn walked up to the door and said he'd like to have a crack at it. The lady told him to knock himself out. Flynn opened the door and walked in. There was a file on the table, and he could see the name, but he didn't need to see it. He said the name, Connor Gray, and sat down in front of him. He asked how they were doing. Connor lifted his head and muttered that they'd sent another one. Flynn smiled and said he was happy to see him too. He knew how to deal with this sort of person. Then he asked, "So, why were they here?" Connor calmly replied not to mess with him. His friend was dead, and Flynn thought Flynn interrupted. Disappeared, not dead. There was a certain difference between the two. He placed his hands on the table. Connor replied that he was dead. Flynn asked if he had disappeared. Why hadn't they found him yet? Then Flynn answered his own question slowly. And if he was dead, why hadn't his body been found? Had Connor ever thought of that? Connor was silent. Flynn asked him why he didn't tell them. What really happened? Connor said he already had, that it was all in there. He asked if Flynn had his file. Flynn lifted the file up. He said, "This? No." He wanted to hear it from Connor's mouth. Connor gripped the table and said he didn't want to repeat. Flynn cut him off. He said he didn't think Connor had much of a choice, kiddo. Flynn wasn't taking no for an answer from a kid, and he was a kid. Flynn looked at the 18-year-old boy in front of him. Shaggy black hair, red eyes, bags underneath them. He looked nothing like the picture Flynn had seen earlier. Connor began. He said Jeremy was his best friend, and that he called him Jerry. They'd lived close to each other ever since their childhood years, so they grew up as brothers. Jerry loved exploring, and soon Connor grew into it too. They'd go out into the woods and explore, just for the heck of it. As they got older, they continued finding stuff. They'd hit the junkyard on weekends for anything that looked cool. Scraps, headlamps, rotors, anything. Checks out, Flynn thought. Connor looked at Flynn and asked if he knew the woods. Flynn nodded. Connor continued. The woods had some sort of a marshy pit, kind of like a swamp thing, right on the edge of the woods. Flynn had heard about it. He asked what about it. Connor said their parents told them not to go around that area. They thought they were kids. That's why they weren't allowed to go there. And when they asked their parents, they just insisted they listen to them, to which they did. Flynn raised a brow and asked if they really did. Connor said for the most part. As they got older, they kind of forgot about it. Until recently, they were in the woods, looking for junk, and they stumbled onto the pit. An accidental discovery. Flynn glanced at the pane. He hoped the officers were getting this. Connor went on. They looked around it, and he didn't see anything really eye-catching. So he turned to go, but Jerry said he saw something pop up in the pit. Connor took a good look and saw it too. The radio. Right in the middle was a radio. Connor shifted in his seat as he said it. He was a science guy, okay? So when he saw it, he knew damn well. It was creepy. First off, all the locals in that town talked about how toxic that pit was. So seeing a radio in perfectly good condition, right in the middle of a hazardous swamp, that was a red flag. Flynn agreed. That was right. Connor said that's what he thought. So he told Jerry they should leave since they didn't find the parts they were after. But next thing he knew, Jerry had a long branch and he was reaching for the damn thing. Flynn asked if he got it out of there. Connor frowned and said he got it out of there. It was in good condition and they decided to check it out. But before they left, Connor thrust one end of the branch into the pit and it fizzled. This confirmed his assumption. It was toxic, and that radio was bad news. Flynn asked why he didn't tell Jeremy then. Connor said Jerry was right there when he poked the swamp, and Jerry said it was all the more reason they should check it out. Connor folded his fists as he said his parents were the strict type, so they took it back to the basement at Jerry's place. It was where they kept all their discoveries and junk. They tried to turn it on, but it didn't respond, so they figured it was the battery. They opened the battery compartment, and there was no battery in there, as they suspected. It was late, so they decided to get batteries the next day and try it. Connor saw this as a sign to get rid of it, but Jerry was too invested in the thing to see his logical point. Flynn asked what happened next. Connor said he woke up to a phone call from Jerry, and he was excited. He told Connor that the radio had turned on. Connor was half asleep, so he told him he was probably dreaming about it. But then he heard Jerry running down the steps, and he heard the most cursed noise he had ever heard in his entire life. It freaked him out so much that he ended the call. Connor winced as he said it. He went over to Jerry's house later that day, and the radio didn't turn on. He asked Jerry what had played, and Jerry said it was just a bunch of static. Then Connor figured Jerry was probably pulling his leg and had actually put some batteries in there, but Jerry denied it. They camped around it to see if it would come up again, but it didn't. Day after day, Jerry would tell Connor how the static was slowly clearing out and that he could actually hear some words from it. Connor said that was another red flag. Flynn asked why that was. Connor looked at him and explained. Jerry's house was downhill, plus the radio was in the basement. There was no way you were getting reception from underground, unless you had a good antenna, and that thing didn't have any antenna. Connor searched the damn thing to see if it was inbuilt, but it wasn't. Flynn said okay. Then what? Connor continued. Then Jerry became withdrawn. He was the kind of guy who could make a joke that could lighten up a funeral service. So after days of having that radio, Connor knew something was wrong. He told Jerry they needed to throw that thing away, and Jerry disagreed. They had a fight over it. Flynn raised a brow and repeated, "A fight?" Connor eyed him and said, "Yeah, a fight. So what?" They didn't throw hands, though. They just jabbed at each other with words. Connor grabbed the radio and told Jerry it was for his own good. and Jerry told Connor he just needed to listen to what it said. Connor didn't buy it though. He took it to the junkyard and tossed it into the scrapper. He went back home and slept over it. Connor started shaking as he said what came next. Then he woke up too. "Oh my God." Flynn asked what. "The radio. The damn radio was playing in his room." Connor yelled it. And worse still, he saw his best friend, in his room, sitting there, just staring at him with bloodshot eyes. Flynn told him to calm down. Then Jerry got up and started dancing to the music playing on the radio, and still staring at Connor with his red eyes. Connor screamed that Jerry never dances. Flynn tried to calm him down. "Deep breath, Connor, deep breath." And it seemed to work. Then he asked what happened next. Connor said he just watched as Jerry danced, and the radio suddenly stopped. Jerry stopped as well. The radio started beeping loudly, and Jerry dived out of the window. Connor's room was on the second floor, by the way. He just sat on his bed, unable to move. Then he passed out. Connor exhaled, and when he woke up, he found himself in a hospital bed, and a bunch of cops were talking to his parents. Flynn began to ask about the radio. Connor cut him off. He said no. He wasn't saying anything again. Flynn had had his story. Flynn repeated the word story. Connor said yeah. The cop buddies thought he was making it all up, especially Flynn's friend Terry. Flynn said Jeremy wasn't dead, okay? They hadn't found a body yet, so they couldn't conclude he was dead. Connor reclined in his seat and told Flynn to say what he wanted. Flynn looked at the glass pane and asked, "The radio, what was it saying?" Connor kept silent. Flynn suggested, "Why didn't they listen to it together?" Connor shot up and demanded to know what Flynn meant. Flynn reached under the table and took the radio out. Connor demanded to know why Flynn had that. Flynn told him it was evidence. It was for the investigation. He placed it onto the table and looked at Connor and said, "Let's." Connor began screaming. He rushed to the door and tried to force it open. Flynn stood up and tried to hold him, but the kid was surprisingly strong. He couldn't latch onto him, so he looked at the pane and motioned for them to intervene. The door opened, and Terry rushed in with the handcuffs. Connor rambled that they didn't know what they were doing. As Terry tried to cuff him, Terry said they had to restrain him and pushed Connor to the wall. He said Connor was the only witness. They couldn't have him hurting himself. The two other cops came in, and they successfully cuffed Connor. As they took him out, Flynn looked at the kid. Connor looked genuinely scared, and Flynn was apprehensive about it. Connor muttered to leave it at the swamp. As the door closed, Terry said, "Well, that was a doozy," as they walked out, and Flynn couldn't agree more. Flynn asked if it checked out with Connor's official report. Terry said not as in-depth, then added that he thought Connor liked Flynn. Flynn scoffed and said not as much as he liked Jerry. Terry stopped and said Flynn wasn't saying. Flynn turned around and asked what. Terry said Connor knew where Jeremy was. Flynn asked how Terry could be so sure. He said, right now, he didn't know what was what anymore. His phone could suddenly start ringing, and he'd be too scared to answer it after hearing all that. They laughed at this, but they knew it was true. Connor's statement had scared them. Shitless, Flynn handed the radio over to the evidence room and said, "Here." The security guy said okie dokie and placed it on the bottom shelf. He attached a note to it. Flynn and Terry walked out of the building. Terry asked, "What now?" Flynn sighed. He said they had to keep digging. For now, though, he was gonna dig into some lunch. Terry smirked and said it was past lunch. Flynn replied, "Not for him." He told Terry he'd see him tomorrow and walked away. The next day, Flynn walked into the police building. He was early and he wanted to check up on Connor. The security guard greeted him, calling him detective, and said he was in early. Flynn smiled and said he decided to get some work done. Then he remembered and asked if anything strange had happened last night. The guard said not really. Thank goodness, Flynn thought as he walked away. Just a bunch of static noises. The guard added, coming from the evidence room.